Welcome everyone. You're listening to Chasing Stillness. I'm your host, Travis. This podcast is for those who are chasing stillness and that want to end the chase. For today's episode, I wanted to share with you 2 life-changing lessons from Zen Buddhism. Okay, so when I first came across these 2, I really had no idea how they would affect me later in life. These were and still remain the cornerstone of my spiritual path and practice, among many other things. It certainly wasn't clear to me for many years that that was even the case. And so with most things, when I first started this path, it took an embarrassing amount of time to convince my false self to even work with these so I could begin to accept these 2 things. Number 1, impermanence. And number 2 was that suffering comes from attachment. Okay, and so here's the thing though. Once I accepted these views on life and really put them into practice, it resulted in a near immediate sense of inner stillness, even before the shift occurred. The effortless stillness that I talk about quite a bit was yet to reveal itself, but it was a relief to have a tiny taste of it at that time. My outlook on life and what I thought it was supposed to look like out there started to shift when I changed my point of view on how I looked at my life and really life in general. I mean, after all, a point of view is just a view from a single point. So when I began to look at my life through a new lens, that lens of impermanence, it was a different point of view and a whole new experience, and the way that I seen the world was much different after that. And it takes a bit of time to see in a new way. And seeing in this way isn't the stillness that I often talk about. It's really more a way of changing your view through our illusions that helps clear the way for that stillness. And accepting impermanence was the second crack in my false self that soon gave way to the waiting reservoir from where everything else flooded and permeated throughout my life. And I'd like to share that with you. So let's dig into the meaning of impermanence so that we have a reference from where to look out while I'm talking about this. And for many, its meaning reaches deeper than we initially might think. Impermanence is defined as a fact or a quality of being temporary. If something is temporary, it can't be constant, which in turn means that it's also change. And change is the one constant in life. Often the false self looks at change with a love-hate relationship. I know it certainly did for me. And it's not quite sure what to make of it, so it brings a lot of confusion to our lives. When things seem to be going bad for us, we have this sudden desire to change it so it'll get better. If the circumstances change for the better, we say, hey, that was really good. That's a relief. And I'm here to tell you it's a short relief, but then again, even that short relief will change quickly enough too. So then when things are seemingly going well for us, we want them to stay the same. We don't want that change because that good feeling, often brings comfort, maybe some happiness and a bit of relief to our life. And when this happens and we don't want things to change, you know what else is there under the surface the whole time? Angst. And I'll tell you what, that it's there isn't such a big deal, but why it's there is a good question to look into. I've wondered why this is, and after a long time sitting with it, working with it, it comes down to impermanence. We inherently know that most things won't last. We want things to remain in our favor, and when they don't, we create our own suffering. And it does this when that, what I call a thunderstorm of thoughts, is compiling in the mind of, this sucks so bad. Why is everyone against me? I just can't seem to get ahead. Then, if we attach so strongly to the feeling of the world is against me, it trips us up and we fall into depression because things aren't going how we want them to go. And there's our suffering. And I tell you what, it's an ugly cycle. I've been there. I've been there. And I tell you what, it's an ugly cycle. And what the good news is, and also that's very key to clearing the path towards awakening, is that once you're aware of this pattern, it begins to loosen its grip. Once it's seen through the true self, is to fully know impermanence. And this isn't an intellectual understanding. It goes beyond that because it cuts to the heart of knowing how life plays out. And soon enough, you'll see how silly it is to fight with it. Once one wakes up, it's one of those things that's just simply known, accepted, and trusted. Your intellect will try to argue with itself at first, but in time, it'll come into knowing. And this brings us to the next thing that Zen Buddhism taught me. And this brings us to the next life-changing lesson that I learned from Zen Buddhism. And that is that suffering comes from attachment. And this is number 2 of the Buddha's 4 Noble Truths. So just for a little context, here are all 4. Number 1, life is unsatisfying. 2, there is a reason why it's unsatisfying. 3, there is an end to it being unsatisfying. And 4, the way out is the Eightfold Path. So that's all of them. And they're really worth a deep study on their own, even if you're not a Buddhist or follow a Buddhism tradition. Or the 4 Noble Truths that I just mentioned, I use the word unsatisfying instead of the typically translated word suffering. But I'll tell you, it's definitely worth your time to dig into the meaning of suffering. But suffering is not quite the same word that the Buddha was recorded as using in this case. The word he used for suffering was actually dukkha. And it's a much more encompassing word than just suffering. So I encourage you to look into the word dukkha and study on it. But for now, let's go back to Noble Truth number 2. So how does suffering come from attachment? And well, quite honestly, we only want what we want. And when we don't get what we want, we create suffering for ourselves. The false self starts to stir up all the reasons, no matter how ridiculous, why we didn't get what we wanted. We blame others, we complain, and in the end, we have just created all of our own suffering. When I came to fully understand that I brought myself suffering just by attaching things I wanted to situations, like outcomes in my favor, it crushed me because I knew I had to own it to get over it. And owning it can be very, very difficult. And by saying own it doesn't mean all the things that your mind is probably stirring up. It's very simple. It's that you just stop denying it and see it directly. And it was at this point in my life when I was just like, wait a second, you mean my suffering is my fault? Yes, of course it's your fault. I thought, how could this be? Especially when I worked so hard at creating and controlling things that were designed to make my life easier. But I'm telling you, I can't get any more direct than this. I caused all my own suffering. There was no one else to blame, nobody else but me. And that stung like a lightning strike. And being forced to see that was devastating. But, really, it was at this moment when I accepted that it was my doing that everything changed. Whether it was the false self or not, it was me and no one else that caused me so much suffering. Taking responsibility for my own suffering was very, very difficult. I pushed it away, denied it, and I still didn't really understand how it could be so. I spent a lot of time contemplating how this couldn't be true. But in the end, something inside knew it to be true, but I still had to sit with it for some reason. I guess it's just like that sometimes. It sticks around until you get the lesson. And I had this illusion that I had to convince my mind that it was true. Something beyond my mind told me it was true, but the but the mind sure needs to be convinced. It can be an amazing thing when one realizes the true self is always there and it's always pointing the way. But for too many of us, we too often listen to our minds than listening to our hearts. When I find myself attached to something, it's not long before that other one shows up. Impermanence, and everything changes. They just work together in such a weird way. And there's a couple other ways that I'll mention that Zen really helped me. And it's really things that Zen emphasizes. And the first one is Zen emphasizes a direct experience. Zen is not a theoretical or intellectual practice, but rather it focuses on direct experience. So by practicing Zazen or sitting meditation and even other forms of meditations like walking or working, I learned to develop, this skill to slow down, both mentally and physically. And that slowing down resulted in me being present and experiencing reality as it is, without the filter of thoughts and concepts. The next thing that Zen taught me was non-dualism, because Zen emphasizes the non-dual nature of reality, which means that there is no separation between the self and the world. And this realization helped me overcome that sense of isolation and disconnection that so often leads to suffering. This brought me a profound sense of peace, connectedness, and stillness. And the third thing is that Zen encourages letting go of attachments. And Zen practice underlines the importance of letting go of attachments, including attachments to thoughts, emotions, and material possessions. And I tell you what, we really love to hold on to our attachments, especially our emotions and thoughts. That should be its own podcast. But this helped me break free from that tornado of desire and suffering. It just goes round and round. So one of the other things that Zen taught me was mindfulness. Zen practice puts a big deal of effort into mindfulness in every aspect of life, not just during meditation. It really helped me become more aware of life's clarity by being attentive and slowing down my actions. Intentionally practicing in this way really led me to a deeper understanding of myself and the world around me. So, I really hope those were helpful to your practice. Of course, these are not all of the things that really helped me on my path that come from Zen Buddhism, but these are the ones that stick out in my mind right now. So I'd like to offer you a couple questions to sit with and maybe work with. So I have 3 different areas that I really practice with my focus. The first one is meditations, the second one is contemplations, and the last one is inquiry. So under the meditations area, I'd like to ask you a few questions to work with, and then we'll go to contemplations and inquiry. So under meditations, what things from the past have I even unconsciously attached myself to that caused me to suffer? And the second question under meditations is, what do I place too much importance on that is impermanent? Under contemplations, here's a few thoughts for you to work with. How different would my life be if I didn't become so attached to my own thoughts? And how would life be more at ease if I accepted the temporary nature of things? And when you contemplate the temporary nature of things, what arises while you contemplate this? And next, under inquiry, if I found myself attached to something that causes suffering, I could fill in the blank. If I discovered I was clenching a feeling of disgust, I could let it go by fill in the blank. So there is just a few questions that you can ask yourself to really work with the topic of this podcast. If you're hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode, And for that, thank you.